And good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Tech Talk. Incredibly, it's the December Tech Talk. It's the last Tech Talk of the year. In some ways, the year has seemed to have dragged on forever. In other ways, the year has just really seemed to have flown. But thank you very much for attending. Welcome to this final session for the corporate reporting edition. I'm Milton Siegel, Senior Executive within Corporate Reporting, and very pleased to have with us again virtually in the studio, Prof. Ahmed Haji, who is the chair of our APC committee. Morning, Ahmed.
Yeah, good morning, Milton. Great to be here on this corporate reporting tech talk today. And I guess one can say great to be here virtually as well. And I'm looking forward to this session and this interaction that we have with our members today.
Great. So the objective of this tech talk is really to give an update on the activities of our Accounting Practices Committee. Ladies and gents, you'll remember from our last tech talk, my colleagues Bungeka and Mulala gave us some updates around the developments within IFRS for SMEs. And if you did miss that, please just be reminded that you can go back on the microsite or on the live stream and go back and rewatch that should you have missed it or should you want to watch it again for those important developments. So what we're going to do today is we thought it appropriate to wrap up the year with an overview of what has been a really busy year for the Accounting Practices Committee. There has been a large volume of work that has come out of the IASB from the International Accounting Standards Board, some really important pieces of work that we felt it really important that we get our members' perspective of, that we are able to contribute to the conversation and give our feedback to the IASB in that regard. Ahmed, you'll remember a conversation that we had about a year ago this time with one of the board members of the IASB, sort of almost warning us in advance that there is a lot that is going to come out of the IASB in 2021, and they certainly did live up to that promise. So therefore 2021 was a very significant year, or still is a very significant year, in terms of the feedback that we give from a SAICA perspective, from a South Africa perspective, from an Africa perspective, and from an emerging economy perspective to the IASB in that regard. So we hope you enjoy this reflection in that regard. Moving on, some of the activities that we want to focus on, before we do that, let's just remind ourselves what the role and what the mandate of the Accounting Practices Committee, or the APC, is. It is one of only 5, and soon to be 6, formal advisory committees to the SAICA board. The APC committee therefore has the mandate to advocate for SAICA members on behalf of the board. It is a very important committee. It is a very well-respected committee. It is, in essence, the voice of SAICA and South Africa and the formal and official communication chain to that of the IASB in that regard. And I guess, again, just to remind us, it is chaired by Prof. Ahmed Haji, who just happens to be on this webinar.
Thanks, Milton. Yeah, I must say it's a privilege to chair such a well-respected committee, domestically and internationally. It comprises members of highest caliber technical IFRS specialists, some of them in South Africa and some of them that have global rep. It has strong and good representation from the audit profession, and this is the technical leads in the various audit firms. This is a very technical accounting committee. In this committee, we're not talking lightly, if I use that point, we're not sort of tipping-toeing around the issues. There are very strong technical arguments that are made in this committee with strong considerations for the practical implications of some of the IASB's recommendations. It is a very important committee, I think, for South Africa. It's South Africa's voice to the international community, specifically the IASB. And it also serves the purpose of also being South Africa's voice for South Africa. So there have been some South African domestic issues that we've worked on, and we'll speak about some of those. We are not a committee that can issue technical pronouncement in South Africa. That unfortunately is not what this committee can do. We cannot go against what ISB says. We all adopt IFRS. So this committee feeds the information upwards. And if there is a potential issue in our domestic space, in our local space, using the various arms that we have, we can bring those to the attention of the ISB so that we are resolving those issues. And there have been some very successful stories over the last couple of years. And in fact, I think we'll talk about one or two of those in the 2021 year as well. The APC has a strong representation from preparers. I think it's very important that we have preparers on board. They bring a real practical experience into the application of some of the principles. We have the observance and the attendance by the JSE, and matters that typically come through from the JSE are the various activities that they do, their regulations, their proactive monitoring activities, their FRIP findings, their headline earnings, or not their headline earnings circular, but the contribution that they make to the headline earnings circular. We also have observance and attendance by the RBA, who also provides feedback on the RBA inspections, and that's of technical interest to the Accounting Practices Committee members. We have observance and attendance by the ISB, and on this point, I'll say keen interest by the ISB on the discussions that take place at the Accounting Practices Committee. And the Accounting Practices Committee itself expands its work through the use of subcommittees. And each of these subcommittees are chaired by an APC member, and the subcommittees are then expanded versions of the actual spaces where the work is being done of the APC. They comprise the representatives of preparers, auditors, regulators, academics, members of the public. It's expanded to beyond just the APC members so that it gets a wide representation in the submission of feedback back to the ISB. These subcommittees, their findings, their views, feedback to the APC via the chair of that, an APC member who's chairing that subcommittee, and ultimately as chair of the APC, every submission that goes to the ISB goes via my desk. We thank the APC members who chair these subcommittees. They do an incredible job of facilitating these subcommittees, as well as maintaining robust discussions and high quality submissions through to the ISB. Great, over to you, Milton.
Thank you, Ahmed. I think on that note, and you mentioned robust discussions, I mean, there were some very robust discussions that had happened in some of the subcommittee meetings. Some committee meetings ran on for hours. For some of these committee meetings, we found the need to have follow-up subcommittee meetings, or even a second follow-up, to allow some of the committee members to go back to their networks, to go read again, to consult. So as you mentioned, really a huge amount of work that goes into by the subcommittee participants, and our gratitude expressed in this regard. Just then looking forward at some of the submissions that we've made during the year. This isn't an exhaustive list, but we wanted to just really highlight on some of the things that we thought were important from a SAICA perspective, from a South African perspective, and of course to you, our members. We spoke to the exposure draft, and again, maybe just to frame this, the context again for a moment, is the IASB itself releases exposure drafts, which are kind of like potential to be converted into a standard going forward, or sometimes they put out a request for information that we respond to. So this was an exposure draft that we responded to that had to do with extending the rent concessions allowance that was originally put forward in 2020. It was important for us to act on it. If I recall correctly, it was a very short response period, I think in the region of about 2 weeks or so. So we had to respond quickly, and we met that objective and responded very much in that case, very much in favor of allowing that continuing of that rent concession, that allowance, to not really worry about if we're into a modification of the lease agreement, but to rather just keep up with the regular accounting in that regard. In fact, if I remember correctly, I think we even asked to extend it for 1 more year. So we asked for 2 more years. I think we got 1 year more out of it. So we'll probably revisit that in a year's time when it comes out next. And we also then sent comments on an exposure draft for the lease liability within a sale and leaseback and what the amendments were, some minor amendments with regards to that. We gave the South African perspective, obviously sale and leaseback, important in the South African context. If one thinks of the airlines, if one thinks of those industries, manufacturing type industries as well in South Africa. So we put that feedback to the ISB as well, which again was very well received in that regard. Ahmed?
Thanks, Milton. And looking at point number 3 on the slide, we worked on a request for information from the ISB, which was involved with their PIR, their post-implementation review of their group accounting standards. So that was the IFRS 10 standard, which dealt with consolidations, IFRS 11, which dealt with their joint arrangements, and their disclosure standards of interest in other entities, which was IFRS 12. We also spent quite a bit of time, this was quite a complex area, on regulatory assets and regulatory liabilities. And we worked on the exposure draft, and we submitted a comprehensive submission to the ISB on South Africa's thoughts of that particular exposure draft.
Ahmed, if I may, those requests for information are a really important part of what we do, because it allows us to give some perspective on what is currently happening on the ground in South Africa, what the auditors are finding, what the preparers are finding, what sometimes the regulators are finding. So it really is a unique opportunity to feedback directly, sort of views, feedback from the ground, to almost be the eyes and ears of the ISB in that regard. So again, a very long process that we follow, but as important as any of the other submissions that we do make there. And again, one of the real highlights of the APC.
We also worked on a very important project, business combinations under common control. There was an exposure draft which was issued, and we spent significant amount of time on this. This was probably one of our bigger projects during the year. Milton spoke about having more than one meeting. I think this was one of those. We also had a outreach or a roundtable. I'll speak a little bit more about that, but we did quite a bit of work on the business combinations under common control exposure draft. We finalized that in good time and submitted that to the ISB. We also did some work on the ICE 21 exposure draft, which dealt with the lack of exchangeability, proposed amendments to ICE 21. That was an important exposure draft, given its the role that it plays in dealing with some of the difficulties that our preparers have with interest in other countries that are exposed to issues around the lack of exchangeability in currency. And we received some very valuable feedback from the preparers, especially some of our multinationals in South Africa, and we were able to include that in the submission to the ISB.
Yeah, thank you, Ahmed. We also responded to the exposure draft on management commentary, which is an area that I'll go into a little bit more detail in a few moments' time. But something really important that we did do is we contributed, or we submitted on the request for information on what's called their third agenda consultation. And that's something quite unique that the ISB do, is that they ask us as a country, they ask us as a contributor, what do we think their workload should be? What direction do we think they should be looking to take? What do we feel should be looked at? What do we feel should be addressed by the ISB? And of course, that is driven by areas of concern that we currently feel, areas of inconsistency, areas where the auditors raise concerns, where preparers raise concerns. And it's a very unique opportunity where we can give our contribution to determining what the output and what the workload of the ISB is. And again, the opportunity to be involved in a committee that can, to an extent, steer the global direction of the work being done by the ISB is indeed a privilege, and very important from a South African perspective, that we make sure that the South African and African emerging economy view is taken into consideration. Another way of thinking about it, If we didn't respond to that, then we aren't able to then critique in any way what is coming out of the ISB and what we think we should be coming out of it. So in a way, they bring us into their confidence. They allow us to guide them in terms of areas that we think they should be focusing on and why. So that is something that is very unique to what we do at the APC, and I think one of the real highlights of what we did in the APC this year.
Yeah, Milton, if I can just maybe add, on the third agenda consultation, cryptocurrencies was a topical, just as an example, a topical matter. So that was carried forward in the request for information. I'm sure many of our members might have questions or interest in that particular area. So that came through strongly, and that was included in the submission to the ISB.
Great.
Then some of the work that we are currently doing, and so they're in progress, the subcommittees are working. Some of these we hope to finalize in the next week or so. Some of them will carry forward to next year. The pilot approach to the proposed amendments to IFRS 13 and 19. So we're working on that exposure draft. I think we've made good progress on that one. I have seen some draft submission of that particular document. So we're almost there on that particular one. And the second one is the request for information, the post-implementation review of IFRS 9, classification and measurement. We've also made good progress on that submission. I've seen a draft version of that document, well balanced, going to be valuable to the ISP, and we hope to be making that submission quite soon.
Yeah, of course, Ahmed, what makes this interesting, and as you said, we hope to get it out in the next week or so, is that in Europe and in the UK, there isn't really such a shutdown that there is here between over the December-January period. So kind of it's almost business as usual, whereas we tend to shut down from a sort of middle of December to second week of January. So some of the deadlines or the periods by which we need to respond look like they're far away, such as the 21st of January, etc. But realistically, in terms of working time, not that far to go. So hence the push from the APC to get as much out as we can still before we wrap up. Moving on to really what I think an important and interesting piece of work that's going on is the exposure draft on subsidiaries without public accountability. Ladies and gents, you hopefully remember and hopefully joined in on the presentation, the roundtable presentation that we had presented by the IASB, by their technical leads, and by their board member, Bruce McKenzie. A really important part, we think from a South African perspective, it looks at ways of reducing the burden, reducing the reporting burden, the complexity around the disclosures of the subsidiary entities themselves, the subsidiaries' own financial statements, sort of driving towards a full IFRS approach, but much closer toward IFRS for SME type disclosure. So again, looking at the concept of who are the users of the financial statements, who is looking to use the financial statements of the subsidiary company. And the conclusion we fast getting to is really, it seems that it's really just the parent company that's looking to use that. And therefore, why would the subsidiary company need to go through all that cost and effort to produce a full set of disclosures when ultimately it could just be wrapped up by the parent in the consolidated set of accounts? So the roundtable was very interesting in that regard. It seemed to be an exposure draft that is getting quite a lot of favor internationally, and therefore our comment letter is important in that regard because of the number of entities that potentially could be impacted in South Africa there. So I think that's got to go back to the ISB by third week of January. It's one of those ones that we will wrap up as soon as we can. And again, what Prof. Ahmed said earlier, a lot of very wise feedback was received during that roundtable discussion over and above what we had already received at the subcommittee level. And we will take those members' views into account in helping shape our overall and final comment letter in that regard. Two other just pieces of work is the exposure draft on non-current liabilities and covenants, some proposed minor amendments to IS1, as well as the very recently came out exposure draft on supplier finance arrangements, some proposed amendments to IFRS 7 and IS7, and that is a project that we'll be taking on in a little bit more detail in come January next year in that regard. In terms of key submissions made during the year, we'll be going into a little bit of detail here. Again, this is something that we referred to earlier on, but in terms of the lease liability, some proposed amendments to IFRS 16 in terms of defining, quantifying what the lease liability in a sale and leaseback is. Generally, we had some disagreement with the proposed measurement principles. We feel that there's an element of inconsistency that's being brought into the way the variable lease payments can be measured for these sale and leaseback transactions. We think it's quite complicated. We're worried about different preparers getting to different answers for the same or similar type of transaction. And then, of course, the impact that that may have when that is being audited by the audit fraternity. So we took those considerations into account. We also had some concerns and considerations around the transitional requirements and how, if this exposure draft were to be rolled out, how we would go about transitioning without going back to almost rework what the lease liability would have been, given the variable component. We were worried about cost versus benefit in that regard. So we put back those considerations to the ISB. And our feedback from engagements in that regard is that we weren't alone in raising those considerations. So therefore, our voice can hopefully strengthen the message to the ISB to continue to deliberate and think around these potential changes before they just go ahead and release that. So again, not all the comment letters that we send back are always favorable. Some of them are quite strongly worded in the opposite direction, and that's very important too. And I think it's a very important role that we play in that regard. Ahmed, to you to carry on.
Thanks, Milton. Yeah, another important submission that we did, and I spoke about this one earlier, was the business combinations under common control. This took quite a bit of work from the teams, and the general overview was that we were supportive of the ISB's work on this project. In South Africa, business combinations are often encountered, and there is a divergence in practice. So we welcome the ISB's efforts to narrow down the accounting methods that are applied to these business combinations under common control. The ISB proposed a decision tree, which we felt provided sufficient guidance to navigate to the two methods. We also found that the two methods proposed would result in fit-for-purpose accounting. They would provide set methods, give guidance, limited set methods compared to the various methods that are being applied in South Africa. We also noted, this is, I think, one of the indicators of a robust subcommittee. We also, whilst we reached support for this ISB's proposal, we also noted to the ISB dissenting views on the book value method. And we also found disagreement with the retrospective application, which was suggested in the proposal, and we suggested a prospective application of a new or revised standards, as simply we found that the retrospective application is not feasible. I say we found, how do we get to these different thoughts? This is the reviews of the debates that take place in the subcommittees, as well as the roundtable discussion, which fed into the comprehensive submission, which we made to the ISB. That roundtable discussion can be found on the live stream, so you're more than welcome to go back and take a look at that one.
Great. Ahmed, another complicated matter that we had to try and get our view across on was that of management commentary. Again, we did host a roundtable presentation by the ISB, by ISB board member with their technical leads. And ladies and gents, isn't that amazing that we've managed to get direct from the global standard setters to them to give us directly to ourselves as members their views and allow us to frame our questions directly to them, in addition to the normal feedback that we would give through the comment letter process. So the management commentary was a difficult one. There was a somewhat unknowns in the management commentary process. Firstly, I think we certainly acknowledged the exposure draft we're supportive of the nature where the IASB are trying under the IFRS mandate to allow management to express their views, to give some commentary, to give a narrative towards the annual financial statements. We did raise one or two questions also around the timing of that and sort of why it came out in sort of Q3 of 2021, given that the prior version of the practice note had come out, if I remember, in 2010. So there was a 10, 11 year gap between the two. And also, as the next point reads, is to how this would potentially interface what would be coming out from the new Sustainability Standards Board that has just been set up by the IFRS Foundation. At the time that we hosted the roundtable, that hadn't formally been announced. The announcement did take place towards the end of November at the COP26 event. Because the management commentary talks to sustainability or elements of sustainability, and we raised questions around where would this fit into it, and would it be a management commentary report as well as a sustainability standards report? Would it be duplication? How would the two work together in that regard? And we posed those questions back to the ISB, asking for their consideration, again, not debating what they kind of wanted to disclose, but also sort of more talking around, is it not going to be a repeat of the same information, and to look at the effectiveness and of course the cost effectiveness of producing this kind of information as well. Probably the most contentious issue that came up in this regard is that related to integrated reporting. As we know, South Africa are the global leader in integrated reporting, the founders of integrated reporting, and through all the listed entities as well as many private entities, South African companies report on and prepare detailed integrated reports driven by the IR framework, the Integrated Reporting International Framework. So some questions were raised, but if we're already reporting an integrated report, that deals to an extent with ESG, that deals with an extent of sustainability, that looks at productivity, that looks at the multi-capitals. Again, would a management commentary be in addition to that, or could an integrated report replace that potentially? So those were the two questions that were put forward. Some more context, which has again happened after the roundtable, that makes this even more interesting. And really, it's like a soap opera. You've got to just keep tuned to it because there's so many developments. Is subsequent to this, the IFRS Foundation, which is almost the parent company of the ISB and the parent company of the ISSB, they have recently acquired the Value Reporting Foundation, which is the old IIRC. And by doing so, they have acquired the rights to all the intellectual property. Long story short, they now own the rights to the IR framework. And therefore, we look forward to seeing how their IR framework, to use an accounting word that they now control, will be refined in and brought into management commentary, what the links between the two will be, how that will link to the conceptual framework that the ISSB will be bringing out around sustainability reporting. So it was a difficult letter to write back because of the relative unknowns and the relative uncertainties, which again, Ahmed, we talked about robust debates. There were some robust debates within these subcommittees. And therefore our role in this regard was to make these aware, to make the ISB aware of the discussions, aware of the challenges, aware of the thoughts in this regard, not really coming up at all times with a suggested solution for them, but rather giving some food for thought, which again, we think is a significant role that we play in that regard. Ahmed, you seem to have given me all the challenging comments that I had to report back on in that regard. Ahmed, over to you for some of the lighter stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Milton. Not sure about light. Headline earnings is always controversial. It's a difficult one, and we issued Circular 1 of 2021, headline earnings in January of 2021. We updated it in 2021 to consider the new amendments to the IFRSs that were issued between July 2017 and August 2020. Those updates were for the treatment of the negative variable rent concession that is applied. It's recognized now in P&L, and there were questions there as to whether it's included or excluded from headline earnings. The amendment to I-16 for proceeds before intended use, we had similar questions around that, whether it's within or outside of headline earnings. We also used the opportunity to do minor editorial changes, including deleting old references to IAS39, where they've been replaced with IFRS 9. Then we did a quick, I call this quick, I think this was one of the easier ones, where the FAQ, frequently asked question, on whether IFRS 9 and 15 and 16 are applicable to entities applying the IFRS for SME standard. That was a quick note that we did, and we responded to that one to say that it does not apply. These three standards are IFRS standards. They're included in the big IFRS, and that the sections relating to IFRS for SMEs remain unaffected, and one would follow the principles contained in those three sections or four sections. We also included a note that the ISB is busy with a separate project on the revision of the IFRS for SMEs, and we would look to that space in future to see what amendments are coming through for the changes that have taken place on the father IFRS and the parent IFRS.
Yeah, and then Ahmed, something really interesting that came out both from our central region as well as our southern region that actually was brought to our attention through the council meetings was some concerns around the accounting for subsequent expenditure on biological assets. There seemed to be inconsistency in terms of sometimes the subsequent expenditure was capitalized to the biological asset, and then the charge to the income statement by way of amortization later on in the life, where other preparers were simply adding it to cost of sales and taking and accounting for it that way, which seemed to a level of inconsistency. We did some research in that regard, and we actually found an IFRIC ruling on the exact question that had come out about 2 years before. And this question was brought to the IFRIC and asked to the IFRIC, is there a need for clarity in that regard? And it was one of those areas that the IFRIC ruled that, yeah, there are two allowed accounting alternates. There's an accounting policy choice. And effectively, while there is an accounting policy choice, that does then allow preparers to either select option 1 or select option 2. So we put out some FAQs in that regard, both for SME reporting as well as for full IFRS, because the same issue had come up in both of them. And what we did ask for, though, is for preparers to consider at least consistency, that if they choose, let's say, accounting option 1, which is to capitalize the subsequent expenditure, then be consistent in the way they disclose that, in the way they account for that, and not to sort of dabble between the various accounting options because of the IAS 8 issues that may arise as a result. Again, very interesting, and it was feedback brought directly by members to us. It wasn't on the APC's workload per se, it wasn't on the workload of the ISB, but we think we added some value to the South African community in that regard. Then another difficult piece of work that we did, which came up a little bit by surprise. It caught us by surprise in the minister at the time, Tito Mbowene's address at the budget speech around potential changes to the tax rate, or changes to the tax rates, but with one or two considerations, one or two things that still had to happen for the tax rate for the rate change to be achieved. It led to questions being posed to the APC about, is this tax rate enacted or not? Should we be preparing the financials using the new tax rate of 27 or the existing tax rate of 28%? And we consulted widely in that regard. We reached out to industry experts. We reached out to our sister committee at SAICA, to the NTC, the National Tax Committee, to get tax expertise view about what would need to happen from a tax perspective, from a legislative perspective, to deem this to be in effect or enacted from a tax perspective, from a legislation perspective. We included the head of tax in that regard, and we're very grateful to him for his time in that regard. He helped us write some of the material, the thought leadership that went out in that regard. And we took a well-informed but conservative approach where again, we are, and our recommendations, and as Ahmed said, it's only guidance, it doesn't carry authoritative power within South Africa, is that at the time of the speech, it was probably the appropriate method to be conservative and to use the 28% for deferred tax to raise the liability at the current rate of 28%, not to run the risk potentially of underestimating or understating the deferred tax liability that may have arisen in that regard. And Ahmed, another difficult one was that of the accounting impacts of the unrest that we unfortunately saw.
Yeah, absolutely. So the July protest unrest, July protest action, we adopted the approach there where we reminded our preparers and our members that many of the pieces that we had done for COVID-related aspects became or are still applicable for the July unrest. And then we attended to a specific matter that related to the presentation of the inventory write-off. So there was some uncertainty as to whether it is part of cost of sales or other operating expenses. We had a challenging time with that because certain audit firms and preparers had very strong views on that, and it became very clear that it's polarized and that that there isn't a clear answer on this particular issue. The education material then proceeds with the direction of it's a matter of judgment, and alerted preparers, auditors, and regulators to apply the necessary judgment in arriving to what would be the appropriate answer for them.
Ahmed, what is evident is that we run out of time. What is also evident is how much the committee and all its members and subcommittee members and participants have done. It was difficult. There was, as we can see, there were some challenging areas that we had to tackle. And thank you to you for your role as chair in steering that ship. 2022 promises to be much of the same. There is a lot of change happening. There's a lot of guidance that will probably be coming out, or the need for it from us in future. But SAICA, be rest assured that the APC will be there to bring this guidance, to make sure that our responses are well measured, well thought out, and are taken seriously by the ISB in this regard. We're also very in the early stages of planning a visit by the ISB to South Africa in 2022, as well as even potentially, and here's a spoiler alert, potentially even the new chair of the ISB may be visiting South Africa next year. And if that does happen, we'll certainly be involving the APC and members in that regard. Ahmed, thank you very much to you for your time. Thank you to the members for dialing into the webcast. And at this point, I'm going to hand back to Gert and the team in studio. From myself, Milton, and on behalf of Ahmed as well, thank you very much. Be safe, have a good festive period, and we look forward to seeing you next year. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.